Buongiorno a tutti. A year ago, during the month of October, the Synod on Synodality met for the first session right next door here to our Salvatorian Mother House. And at that time, we invited Mrs. Kelly Paget, who is an official voting member of the Synod, to come and share her perspective. What makes this quite unique is that she is not a cardinal or a bishop or even a priest. So, welcome back, Kelly.
Thank you, Father Joe.
That's great. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yes. But before we start, could you just share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So yes, my name is Kelly Paget. I am the Chancellor of the Diocese of Broken Bay and Head of Mission Broken Bay. Probably more importantly, I'm a wife to Chris, and I'm the mother to 3 little boys, Denny, Samson and Oscar. And I live in the Diocese of Broken Bay in Australia, which is just north of Sydney, in the parish of Gosford, which is a Salvatorian parish.
Great. So you've had quite a connection with Salvatorians?
Yes.
Great. Great. What would differ in the second session compared to the first session?
Good question. I think partly what I noticed is very much when I first walked into the hall that for myself, a lot of the fear was gone. When I came here the first time around, I was very fearful. It was very anxiety raising walking into that hall. 360 members, only 70 of them are non-bishop members. And that's the first time that's ever happened at a synod as well. 35 of those 70 are female. So I was very much clearly the odd one out in the room. And so it was very nerve-wracking. And it took a lot of courage to speak when it was my turn to speak. This time around, it was like going back to a family reunion. We were walking into the hall and everyone was hugging each other and welcoming each other. And so we were able to start the conversations really quickly and get back into that rhythm of those conversations in the spirit without fear or trepidation, I suppose, of entering into those conversations.
That's great. Now, did you happen to notice that people's attitudes and thinking changed from the first session in general?
Oh, definitely. There was a number of people who had actually become more comfortable with the process. There were many last session in particular who were very uneasy with the process. The conversation of spirit is a methodology that you do need to practice to get used to. It involves a lot of listening and holding back when you're speaking. So a lot of people were unfamiliar with that process, but there were also many people in the room who didn't think people like myself should be in the room. So they were very anxious as well, but certainly 1 year on, I think that anxiety was almost completely gone and people were very familiar with the process. And I certainly recognise it with a number of members who I had sat at tables with last year and then got to sit at a table again this year. And I saw the difference in them and their ability to engage in the process.
What do you think was most transformative for people? Did you witness aha moments?
Yeah, aha moments, yeah. Certainly, one of the things we, I think, articulated well in the document is the conversations were transformative because, and I heard a beautiful sentence from one of the bishops at one of the tables, who was one of the bishops who really struggled last year with listening. He actually said at the table, talking about a fairly controversial topic, and he said to the bishop across the table, he said, I really don't agree with what you're saying. He said, but help me understand where your people are coming from. And I thought, what a beautiful question to seek understanding. It wasn't just about polar opposites, and the topic was polar opposites, but he was willing to say, what is it about this topic that makes the people in your local church so passionate about this? Let me try and understand. So that was the conversion I saw straight there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of provocative, contentious topics, or even were there surprising topics that arose, or what were those different topics?
I think most of the surprising topics, or not surprising, the controversial topics were raised in the first assembly. And what the Holy Father had done was he tried to take those off the table so we could actually talk about more the process of synodality, how it affects our governance and what it means for the spirituality of our church. However, some of those topics kept coming back again because they were important to people to hear. So things like that did resurface, the role of women resurfaced, the role of ordained ministry in general surfaced to the top. There was a lot of conversation, particularly in the middle section, around governance of dioceses and the role of the bishop and how they use consultative and deliberative decision-making. That was interesting because it really required some of the bishops to sit back and reflect on what their role is. One of the ones that really drew to the surface for me, which I was somewhat surprised by, was the conversation around bishops who don't have seats and how many bishops in the world don't have a diocese to actually look after, and what does that mean, and therefore what is the identity of a bishop if he hasn't got a people that he is shepherd to. And that was an interesting conversation that flew out of a number of days that kind of got to that point of, well, what is the identity of a bishop then? And do they have an identity without a people?
Interesting. Now, I know some of the provocative topics that arose were the LGBTQ plus, and then even polygamy came up.
Yes.
Which is interesting that I think some people were surprised.
Yes.
Yeah. And how did they work with that and get or speak to it or kind of table it or?
Yeah. So in between the first and the second, some of those things, particularly like the polygamy, for example, that was taken into a study group. And so there was 10 study groups that were established by the Holy Father where experts would actually discuss those key topics. One of them was around ministerial norms, and that's where the female diaconate, for example, was discussed within study group 5. Now those study groups are actually going to continue on until the middle of next year. And so their findings will be presented to the Holy Father then, and he will consider what to do with those reports. But the topic still came up on the floor because it does affect some of those big topics like polygamy, which was a surprise to me last year, but like our welcome or lack of welcome to LGBTQ plus peoples, that does affect how church communities work and how they relate to people. So it did come back. And if you read the document, for example, last year's final document didn't mention anything about those in diverse sexual relationships, those who are remarried, for example, where this year there is a sentence in the document again about them and our need to reach out to them in pastoral ways. Yeah.
So was there any point that you were disappointed, that maybe some expectations you had weren't met?
Yeah. Look, there was some, and it was documented in the media at the time, that study group 5. So I was interested in that because it really did look at the role of women in the church. And at the beginning of our assembly, we did have reports from all the study groups. They were a little bit light on. And so there was a request, and the Holy Father agreed to have meetings with the study groups so members could come forward and meet with them. There was one afternoon where that was all arranged, and the one for study group 5 unfortunately was not well arranged to the point where none of the study group members were actually present. And I went to 2 other study groups as well, and very different scenario. They gave wonderful reports, and study group members asked questions of us, we asked questions of them, and it was very much a dialogue. But study group 5 was poorly facilitated, which unfortunately raised a lot of questions and a lot of anxiety, and that was a really disappointing moment for me because I thought, oh, if this is what study group 5 is going to be like, I'm really disappointed all of a sudden. To their credit though, they actually re-met with study group 5. Interestingly, a lot more people came to the secondary meeting. And really impressively, what they did, the prefect for the dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, who chairs that study group, agreed at the end to release the audio transcript of that entire meeting to public, which was interesting because I think he realised the need for transparency with this matter. It was really important that they were going to be transparent. So that was, for as much as a week earlier I was very disappointed, I thought the growth of our church once again in that moment was really beautiful.
Excellent. So let's look at the other side. Did anything exceed your expectations, particularly?
I must admit, the final document, I was really unsure what it was going to look like, and I was struggling to see, particularly at the beginning of this session, what are we coming up with here? And there were questions about what is our purpose? Are we writing a letter for the Holy Father? Is it for the people of God? What are we actually trying to achieve here? So when we got the first draft of the document about 3 weeks in, I was so pleasantly surprised what a beautiful document it was. It was good, it wasn't great, but it was a good document, which left us a lot to talk through. But so when we got the final document on the last day, I was actually really pleased with it. It certainly did encapsulate the conversations that we'd had, not just in that month, but over the 3 years. I think it really well describes what synodality is. I think we've struggled to define it up until this point, but I think this actually does give a better definition and a lived experience of this experience. And look, I was really pleased because there was a couple of paragraphs in there that I knew that was my voice had been heard, and it came out in specific paragraphs. And so that was very emotionally overwhelming for me. In fact, a couple of people came running over to me in the first draft and they said to me, "Have you seen paragraph 115, 115? And I said, "I'm not there yet." And they said, "That was because of you, Kelly." Now, paragraph 115 became 63 in the final document. But it was that moment of realising that I'd been heard on the synod floor. But more importantly, the needs of my son that I raised were heard by our church and will forever be in a church document now, which is pretty incredible.
Could you elaborate a little?
Sure. So paragraph 63 is actually about how we as a church welcome those who live with additional needs and those who live with disabilities. More importantly, it says that the church shouldn't just be, or people with disability shouldn't just be the recipients of the mission, but they actually are active participants in the mission. And it then goes on to say, with that, the church is going to begin a research group to look at how they can welcome people with additional needs, but also to use their giftedness within the church. And so that was pretty amazing after talking about my son on the synod floor who lives with autism and how I just yearn for a place for him to be welcomed, but also a place where he can thrive as a missionary disciple of Jesus.
Wow. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah, Kita.
It's very hopeful, isn't it?
It's very hopeful, and yeah, that was one of those moments where I was just so overwhelmed that the purpose of having a woman and a mother in the room, you wouldn't have heard that story unless you had a woman and a mother in the room. But because the Holy Father was brave and invited a broader representation to the Synod of Bishops, they were able to hear that. So yeah, it's very empowering.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, now the document was over 50 pages. It's got 150 paragraphs, and you had to go through one by one and vote on that.
We did.
Now, it's my understanding that they voted strongly, positively on most. There was only like 6 or so that were a little bit so-so.
Yeah.
And the lowest, from what I understand, was paragraph 60, regarding diaconal ordination of women.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah. Paragraph 60 was the one that I was worried about going into the voting, because the paragraph more broadly is about the participation of women. There's a sentence at the end that talks about the openness to discussing diaconal ministry. And interestingly, the quote that's actually taken from there was what was said by the prefect for the Dicastery of Faith, who's in charge of Study Group 5. So we weren't making up things. He was talking about the fact the Holy Father is still open to this conversation. He's spoken about it not being mature yet, and I think sometimes in our English translation we've understood that somewhat poorly, to say that he said no. He's saying we're not ready yet, and that the studies aren't ready yet. He hasn't shut down the studies though. The studies are still ongoing, and that's very much what we were told in Study Group 5, that there is evidence on both sides, basically is what they've said, but neither is telling us to step forward, but also neither side is telling us to stop. So that we need to keep looking at it. However, I did know that was going to be the one where it's going to cause the most concern. And it would have been really troubling for me if that whole paragraph had gone down because of that one sentence. I wasn't in disagreement of that sentence, but it would have taken the whole paragraph out, which would have been really disheartening for someone who's clearly a woman.
Right.
And I've given my whole life to the church, and so it would have been a little disheartening, to say the least. But it did pass, and it did pass with 24 votes. So you have to remind myself, it got over the line by 24, but it was the only one that got under 300 votes. Everything else got above 300 votes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, someone raised up, I think, regarding like possibly the negative voting from both sides happened because one group felt it didn't go far enough, the other group felt it was going too far, and that's where you get that.
Correct, yeah. And I think that was one of the things I had to look at when I read the final document on the Saturday. I had to look at it and say, am I in agreement enough with all these paragraphs that I think that this is good enough to go through? There was some wording in the document that I still cringed a little bit at. I wished we'd written it slightly differently. There was actually a little bit in paragraph 63 about disability that I wish they'd changed the word. But in the end, I had to look at it and say, on the whole, though, I'm in agreement with this. And so I was voting, I'm a half glass full kind of person, I suppose. But I would agree there were some that would have been voting no because it wasn't strong enough for them. So there, but other than that, it was actually a very joyful room that night because it was passing with such significant numbers, most of the paragraphs.
So I get the impression that you are pleased with the document.
Yes,
You clearly stated that. What do you think is like the deepest, most key message about the document, do you think, for the church?
One of the things I think is very foundational for it, it actually states twice in the very beginning of it that synodality is constitutive of the church. In other words, it's not a fad on the side. It's actually the basis of who we are, being gathered in communion around Jesus. And even though we all have differentiated roles, some of them being ordained and some of them coming from our baptism, or all from our baptism, being synodal is actually who we are as Christians. And not just Catholics, as Christians. So we had other fraternal delegates in the room, some that were Orthodox and some from the evangelical and Protestant movements. And so really that call to synodality is for all of us. And so I think that was key. There were some really good parts in there around governance, the structure. So what does it physically look like within a church body? And so I think that section of it is really good, clarifying the role of the bishop and his consultors that work around him. So some of those elements I think are very good. I also just love the way that they've used scripture to tie it all together. There's a really beautiful link to scripture and the link to the resurrection, which is really beautiful. So it doesn't just make it a document full of theory. It actually becomes quite a beautiful spiritual document to read.
So what's the next step now?
Great question. It's surprising, I think, because all of us entering into that room the night to vote, we all thought we would vote, it would pass, it would go to the Holy Father, and then the Holy Father would then discern what he was going to do. Most synods, the Holy Father would then write an apostolic exhortation. So we all thought we'd kind of be going back home, continuing on our into our culture of synodality, but we'd have to wait for an apostolic exhortation. And of course, the Pope, in a very synodal way, said, we've done the work. The whole point of this synod was we met synodally and we've actually come up with this document. And so I'm going to sign this right now and this document is it. And I'm not going to release an apostolic exhortation. So I think that threw us all. In the room, we weren't expecting that at all. But it does mean for us now, I think taking this document and bringing it to life, there's still a lot of formation needed for people, a lot of telling the story, because as we all talked about, there's still a lot of fear about the concept of synodality. I think people are scared of it, thinking it's new, it's revolutionary, when in fact it's not. And So I think that continued formation is something that I'm very excited to be part of. And yeah, bringing this document to life. That's definitely the next step.
Okay. So now going back to Australia and reflecting on your experience, what words of encouragement do you have for our people listening?
I would say read the document. It really is a beautiful document. Take the opportunity to read it maybe with some friends in your local churches and to pray with it. And then the key to synodality is being in communion with one another. And so if you're just the one person doing it, it makes it very difficult. So finding your people to read it with and to have hope. The Holy Spirit really is moving us through this time. We're about to enter into a Jubilee year where we're going to be focusing on hope. And I had this overwhelming sense of hope at the end. When I was walking into St. Peter's Basilica for the final Mass, and that was such an extraordinary moment as a lay person walking in procession before the Mass began. I was very overwhelmed with tears, and it was that hope that we're not hopeless, and at a time where our world is full of crisis, Christ brings us hope, and that we actually have a beautiful gift in our church that we could be using for our world's advantage to bring that hope.
Exactly. That's wonderfully put. And it is amazing, and I think we all can learn from it, particularly world leaders. Now, here's one world leader who created this situation, gathering people from around the world, an incredibly complex international, group, sitting around the table, speaking, listening, respectfully, and peacefully.
Peacefully, yeah.
And maybe this is really at the root and the hope that we have for the church as well as the world.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for joining us and sharing your perspective on this. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, and who knows, we'll see you again maybe.
Maybe.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.